Hello and welcome to On Point. I'm Callie Raglin. The average California college student spends a little over $14,000 per year on tuition. According to the California Budget and Policy Center, college tuition and fees in California are more than 13 times higher than they were in 1980, making it much harder for students to come out of college debt-free. In fact, about 47% of graduates from public California colleges have student debt averaging about $20,000, according to College Insight. Governor Gavin Newsom recently visited the CSUN campus to sign new college affordability legislation. One new law aims to lower the cost of student housing by requiring each UC and Cal State campus to focus on affordable options in their student housing plans. All of this is part of a $2 billion investment into student housing, which Newsom says is one of the largest student housing bills ever in California. But Newsom also vetoed another bill that would have made Cal Grants available to more students. The Cal Grant program offers up to $14,000 per year to students attending the state's public colleges and universities, and the recipients do not need to pay that money back. In a statement, the governor's financial office claimed that this bill would have cost hundreds of millions of dollars annually, and this decision was really hard to hear for financial aid advocates and student leaders, who argued it would have provided access to 160,000 more students. Today, on Point, we'll speak with student leaders and advocates from California community colleges, Cal States, and UCs about the future of financial aid for students in California. On Point's Jonathan Giovanazzi has more.
Thank you so much, Callie. We have three guests joining us today. With us, we have Sasha Perez. She is the Director of Public Affairs at the Campaign for College Opportunity. We also have Michael Schouten. He is the Chair of Legislative Affairs at CSUN Associated Students. And lastly, but certainly not the least, we have Sona Tigranyan. She is representing College of the Canyons as their Social Student Involvement Coordinator. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. The first thing we're going to dive into is something every student in the state should know more about, and that is access to financial aid, because everyone can always use more aid. Assembly Bill 469 was signed into law on October 6th of this year, and this law requires schools to ensure all grade 12 students complete and submit a free application for financial student aid, or a Fafsa. If a student is exempt from paying non-resident tuition, they'll submit a form for purposes of the California DREAM Act. Michael, I wanted to start with you. What does a free application for federal student aid, or a Fafsa, do? And is requiring that important for students?
Thank you first and foremost for having me. The FAFSA, or the free application for federal student aid, is a form you would submit typically in your senior year and prior to entering college, and you would submit that. It asks some financial information, your parents' income, your income, a lot depending. And then based on that application, you're matched, and also depending on your state and what your state programs offer as well. This gives you a number, EFC, expected family contribution. Really requiring it in high school is going to be really essential. If students aren't required to do something, then they tend not to do it. If we put this, urgency, I guess, on students to go ahead and complete these applications, then, more than likely they'll be awarded aid or have had that opportunity introduction.
Thank you, Michael. Sasha, I want to follow up on that. Do you think the Fafsa is easy for students to fill out? Do you think there should be changes made to that process for students to get money? Obviously, they're requiring it now, so it, makes it's obvious that they have to fill it out. But should things be easier?
Yeah, absolutely. The FAFSA, I'm, going to just say it straight out. It is a very complicated application, especially when you're talking about juniors, seniors in high school who are filling this out for the first time that might even not know what a social security number is. And so, part of what the bill is supposed to be doing is making sure that we are working with local education agencies so that the state is providing them with support, so that students will have somebody to support them through filling out this application. And this is not only a requirement just for our high school students, this is also a requirement for all students, so that includes our undocumented students as well. So even if you are undocumented, you must complete the CATA application unless you opt out of that. And so there's really a lot of education that has to happen, not not just with our students, but also with the first generation families that might be kind of hesitant to provide this kind of information, either to the government that might have questions about this idea of, free money, are there ties attached? There can sometimes be some fear associated in going through this process. And so you really need resource officers to be able to answer these questions and to help students and families through that process of completing the application.
Thank you, Sasha. While we're on the topic, I had the privilege of attending a press conference with Governor Newsom. He says he is very happy with the new bill, AB 469, and says it comes in an effort to provide more outreach to California students. We're going to take a listen to how he thinks this bill is helping.
More outreach, getting forms filled out even before you enter in the system of higher education. That's the FAFSA efforts, the efforts we're doing to supplement outreach to kids that are on the margins, the centers we've done for Dreamers, the work we're doing across the board for financial aid, easing points of access.
All right, so that's just a brief soundbite from Newsom as we were talking. He says the bill that we're discussing now will help more students in California. He mentions more outreach. He mentions expanding access. But Sasha, I want to follow up with you. Will a FAFSA requirement really do the trick in getting more kids to go to college? Will this new requirement really help at all? Or is this just something that looks like it's helpful? What's your take on that?
So I actually think that this is going to have a huge impact, particularly on enrollment for some of our most low-income students. What we find is that low-income students and undocumented students tend to not go directly into college, and they miss out on crucial aid because they're not filling out their FAFSA, they're not filling out the CATA because they think that they're ineligible. And so making that a requirement, and I really want to emphasize the requirement is less a burden on students, and this is really a burden on our educational institutions, and really placing the onus onto our K through 12 systems to take some responsibility in making sure that our students are completing these applications and that they are putting in an effort to make sure that every student knows how much aid is on the table, if they're eligible for the Pell Grant, if they're eligible for the Cal Grant, because that could be a game changer in determining whether or not a student goes to college.
Thank you, Sasha. Sona, my question for you, Newsom also mentions the bill's impact to the California DREAM Act, which essentially allows some undocumented students to apply for and receive state-based financial aid, and institutional scholarships. My question, is this something you agree with? Is this something that's good for our state?
Personally, I come from a family of immigrants, and in my opinion, I believe that education is not a privilege. I believe that education should be a right for anyone who wants it. In my own personal experience, some immigrant students can be some of the best for a college campus. They can really provide the biggest impact because they have such a unique perspective on life and on how they value things. They tend to value their education because they realize it's much harder for them to get, especially in this country, that it kind of feels like everything is against them. So I believe that making financial aid readily available for dreamers especially is really crucial. So I agree with Gavin Newsom on that.
Do you see their impact at your own school, on your own campus?
Oh, definitely. We've had Syrian refugees come to our campus, and they've been like, hearing their stories has had like the biggest impact on every other student and every other professor there that hears them. And it really makes you realize what you're fighting for, especially in higher education. You're fighting to make the world a better place, to encourage discovery, to encourage unity and diversity. And what better way to do that than to have a diverse campus with a bunch of people coming from different backgrounds.
Absolutely. Thank you all for that. Very insightful. Also signed on October 6th of this year was AB 1377. This bill requires the chancellor of the CSU and requests the president of the UC to determine the projected student housing on each campus for the 2022-2023 fiscal year, all the way up until the end of 2027. Michael, you're a student leader at CSUN, and we see an affordable housing crisis across LA. Rent's expensive. I would know. I pay rent in LA. But is there really an affordable housing crisis on college campuses? What does that mean for students?
I think across the state, there's an affordable housing crisis. Nationally, there's a lot of talk about infrastructure package right now. But on California, the economic level, even just this past week at the economic conference, Sears Economic Forum, housing is a huge issue. Thankfully, in this last legislative cycle, we had Senate Bills 9 and 10, Skinner and Weiner. Really introduce these key changes to how we can build more affordable housing. The issue, especially Northridge faces, being in LA, is, we really face a hard time here. And I've got a number here for you. But by an estimate, 1 in 10 CSU students and 1 in 20 UC students are homeless, and that's 1 in 5 of every California community college student are considered homeless. So housing, definitely huge. But to touch on the issue about affordable housing as it relates to this bill, we've got to crack down on cities that have the NIMBY approach, the not in my backyard, the single family plots, that's it. This Senate Bill 9 and 10 both look at ways in which, in 10 specifically, how municipalities can authorize up to 10 at market rate apartments, and forgive me on the wording, but apartments, and then under SB 9, a single family zoning to 4. And so those we'll start to play a huge impact in how much affordable housing we have to offer. If you don't have housing, the less houses we have, just by simple supply and demand, the higher costs they're going to be. If you look at areas like Fullerton, where the market rate is exceeding how many individuals they have living in their community, and that's something we should start to look at what other universities are doing.
I'm going to go ahead and play a clip from a CSUN student now who lives on campus. Let's take a look.
I was actually thinking about not dorming next year because it's expensive. So if they do make it more affordable, I definitely would love to stay. It's so convenient, especially because I don't live out here. And it just makes it so much easier to come to CSUN.
Making it easier to come to CSUN, that's a big deal. Part of her entire time at CSUN has to do with being able to live on campus. Michael, as someone who represents our school, is this something you've heard before from other CSUN students? And do you think this new legislation surrounding housing insecurity came too late?
I don't think legislation is ever too late. I don't think anything is ever too late. The minute you start, change progresses. So I would say, would we have liked to see this sooner? Definitely. I think everybody can agree on that. In terms of hearing from other students, yeah, housing is a huge issue. Myself, this semester, my classes are all online. In January, my classes, which have lab components, are going to be in person. I live at home right now. I'm Zooming to university. Northridge is about about 40 miles away, so about 80 to 100 miles round trip for me. That's nothing. That we see some students traveling, and in recent studies, and we'll get that data. We see students traveling over 2 hours to get to campus. Those radiuses increase as the disparity for housing, they're proportional with each other. Really, but we really do have to look at the local city governments and their inability to build structures, because the funding can come from the state to implement building in the CSU and look at these buildings and structures. But unless the cities allow for the zoning edits, then no buildings will be built.
Right. I absolutely understand what you're saying. And like you said, maybe these Senate bills and AB 1377 didn't come too late. Maybe legislation doesn't come too late. Maybe it does, depending on your perspective. But Sasha, I want to follow up on that. Will AB 1377 and these Senate bills work, in your opinion? It's pretty much forcing CSU officials to become more involved in student housing. Is that enough?
I think we're going to see, right? I think we're going to see how this is going to impact. I think there's a lot of pieces at play here, right? I think, Michael touched upon a very good point, which is that zoning plays a very big role in this, right? Many of our universities are going to have to work with local cities in order to ensure that they're able to build this kind of dense housing that students need. And so it's going to be a process. And I expect that there is going to be hiccups in that process. But I think that this is a good faith effort on behalf of the state to try to resolve this issue, because constantly what I hear when I'm working with students is that housing and food and gas are some of the major things that they're having to pay for and cover that's typically not taken into consideration within their financial aid, but it's some of their business biggest costs, especially living here in California.
I appreciate that, and we're talking about costs in California. It's very expensive to live here, and the state has done its best to really make things easier. In their opinion, to make things easier for students. As we crafted this show together, we spoke to some other student officials. This panel has two of them, but we spoke to some other student officials who feel that the state took too long to create some of this legislation that provides resources to students. I'm going to go ahead and play a clip from an interview I had with Mohammed Al-Muwassin. He is the Chief Justice of Associated Students at University of California, Riverside, so he plays a big role in their school and in that association. And he thinks there's been too much unnecessary spending in the past. Let's go ahead and take a listen.
They're taking a lot of necessary resources, a lot of necessary funding away from the faculty, away from the students, and divesting it into the superficial aspects of the campuses. Instead of spending millions of dollars on a football field, how about you use that in order to give student workers more wages, student workers more resources, students in general just more opportunities on the campus.
Millions of dollars on buildings, on football fields. Sona, is this a problem that should really be addressed? Has there been reckless spending by community colleges, CSU, state officials that should have been directed toward financial aid?
I have seen it on pretty much every single campus, something similar to that, where they're either building a new science building, or they're building a new teacher's lounge, or they're building a new parking lot, versus things that students would really, really benefit from just to be able to survive. Student housing in particular, if you ask a student if they're going to prioritize living and being able to afford to eat and have a roof over their head versus going to school, most people, unfortunately, are going to have to choose to live, and instead of focusing on their education, which is really unfortunate. So I do agree that there has been, honestly, there's been some misuse of funding when it comes to when it comes to how the student, or not the students, how the administration and many colleges and universities do tend to use their funds.
Sona, thank you. Sasha, do you agree?
I would say it really just depends, right? I think each institution, right, the CSUs, the UCs, the community colleges, each one are different. I've certainly, seen certain cases where, I think money could have possibly been better used elsewhere. And I think we often hear that sometimes from students as well, right? That they want to see more resources available to support them in completing their degree. And that's often a topic that comes up. And oftentimes, unfortunately, our institutions don't necessarily follow that direction. And so, I think more than anything, it's going to differ campus by campus. But I think what to me is most important and often gets lost in this process is that institutions really listen to students and really take direction for them and guidance from them on where they think these dollars should be spent.
We have to realize, too, that when we look at state funding, when we look at the funding provided by the state, certain things are to be used for certain projects. So, the equation that I heard earlier from, I believe, a student at Riverside was that, why don't we, instead of building football fields and stadiums, why aren't we investing more in our student worker hourly? That would be great if that funding was unrestricted to do those things. What we don't talk about is that, this funding is used for infrastructure, that we don't talk about the economic and environmental impact reports that go along with these things. There may be, we are building this because it's a more sustainable building that is going to, crumble in the next Northridge earthquake. Knock on wood, none of that ever happens. But we really have to be, it's easy to just see things on the surface for that's a university and I don't see students getting paid. But it's a greater and a more challenging thing to take a step back and realize where's the funding coming from and who's allocated that funding and how is that process going on. If we had slush funds to spend on anything, I'm sure all of the issues would be addressed. But we do have to look at things holistically and take a step back.
I want to go ahead and jump into a vetoed bill now, and I'm referring to the Cal Grant Reform Bill, Assembly Bill 1456. The current Cal Grant system is criticized as being overly complicated, and this bill would have consolidated multiple Cal Grant programs into 2 Cal Grant awards, guaranteeing access to an award for all California community college students with an expected family contribution of $0. Sasha, my question for you is, what are the multiple programs that would have been consolidated? Can you touch on that?
Boy, I wish I could simplify that for you in just a couple of words, but I'll do my best. So, really AB 1456 intended to create really 2 different Cal Grants. One that would be eligible to students that were enrolling into community colleges, and one that would be eligible to students that were enrolled into 4-year institutions, the Cal Grant 2 and the Cal Grant 4. And essentially what it would do is it would take into account whether or not you were Pell Grant eligible, so whether or not you were a low-income student. And if you were, you would essentially have all of your tuition completely covered when you enter into a 4-year institution. So it would be a full ride. And then on top of that, any sort of additional aid that you would receive would go and build on top of that. So it would cover your basic cost of living. So living expenses such as rent, and these other kind of expenses, right? Food, gas, all these other things. The same thing goes for the community college system. So it would have made it, right now, community colleges typically are completely free. There are some challenges for students that, age out or are returning to community college. And so it would have wiped some of that out. Now, I will say, although AB 1456 was vetoed, there were certain provisions within AB 1456 that we did see get implemented. And that actually opened up and expanded eligibility to over 100,000 students. So there is kind of a silver lining there. That doesn't mean that we stopped doing the work, but I think we saw some movement, and I think that that's important to remember as we're having this conversation.
Thank you, Sasha. Sona, the vetoed bill, and Sasha touched on it, it really could have, and a lot of legislation has affected students at your school, California Community College students. Sasha mentioned that time out of high school limitations and GPA thresholds would have been eliminated should AB 1456 have passed. And to me, those ideas sound pretty good. My question is, was vetoing this bill a good idea? Was this something that is okay for students in our state?
I don't really know their particular reasons for vetoing this bill, but it seems to me, like just reading it from on the outside and in my own opinion, that the bill did have a lot of really good ideas. And I'm not sure which ones were implemented, as Sasha mentioned earlier. But I do think that GPA limitations in high school, gap between high school graduation, having all those limitations really just discourages students a lot. And again, we as higher education advocates, we shouldn't really be wanting to limit the amount of students who want to, or the amount of students who can get an education if they want it. We shouldn't really be making sure that there's less of them there. There's plenty to go around, honestly, when it comes to colleges. We have seen already really decreasing enrollment rates, especially after COVID. So there's plenty of room to go around. So honestly, I think that I'm not too sure, I'm not too sure why the bill was vetoed, but in my opinion, it may be good to reconsider it.
Right. Michael, Sona touched on it, and we've touched on this throughout this entire discussion, actually. California is such an advocate in expanding outreach, providing access to higher education, but is vetoing this bill sort of the opposite of what the state claims its goals are for higher education? How do you feel?
I don't speak on behalf of the governor, but him and his finance department have reasons. I know that one of those reasons is that under the bill, There was some talk that both the CSU and the UC would only be able to receive the Cal Grant portion of tuition and fees, and not to cover anything that was under non-tuition expenses, which is something being highlighted: textbooks, gas for your car, transportation, those things. I know a lot of students, including myself, supported the bill. Sad to see it die. But take that with what you say, take it with a grain of salt, I guess. There's always another legislative cycle. So what didn't get through this cycle may get through in the future. But I would say that based on AB 132 and in that trailer budget, in that trailer bill for the budget, the governor and the state and the legislature has definitely kept their promise to invest in higher education. May not be to the extent that we were hoping, but there is definitely investment in higher ed.
Sasha, after hearing that, and Sona touched on this, so it's basically a combination of both of their responses. There's a huge lack of enrollment in community colleges right now. Although we have seen reform to the Cal Grant and we've seen progress, will this veto make things worse in terms of enrollment?
I don't know if I would say that it would make things worse. It certainly would have improved things to have it passed. One of the things, like I mentioned before, some of the provisions in the bill that did make it in through the budget process was the time out of high school piece. So that was included, as well as the age. So it got rid of the age requirement. So this was really big for California's community colleges, because many of our students that are returning to community college, sometimes they are student parents, oftentimes they are adult learners who have been out of school for a very long time. And so getting rid of that age requirement, getting rid of time out of high school opens up aid to low-income students that are this older group that typically wasn't able to take advantage of these opportunities, and that would definitely benefit. Now, one of the big things that were not included was the GPA requirement. So AB 1456 would have gotten rid of the GPA requirement. One of the reasons why that's so important for some of our older students is because, I want you to imagine a situation where, maybe you've been out of high school for about, 15, 20 years. Your high school grades and your GPA is not reflective of your ability to learn now. So, whether you graduated with a 2.0, a 1.0, whatever it may be, you were an entirely different person 15 to 20 years ago. And so we're hoping to see that phase out. And, I think we need to just continue to fight and advocate, right? As I think some folks have mentioned already, our community college students receive the least amount of aid, because our aid really doesn't take into account the full cost of attending college. And so, students have really, I think, changed the discussion on financial aid to focus on this real cost of college. And so I think the legislature has made this a priority, and we need to continue this advocacy leading up until 2022 in order to get all these provisions that were in 1456 to become law.
That's going to be all the time we have today. I really appreciate each of you three for joining us today. This is CSUN On Points. We'll be right back.
What are you looking for?
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media at CSUN On Point. You can hear us on KCSN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings at 5:30. And you can watch us on LA 36 and Santa Clarita Valley Television. For all of us here at On Point, I'm Callie Raglin.